This is Mindset, mental health news and information. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, James Curtis. What we do on Mindset is more than just bring you cutting-edge news and information about mental health. Instead, we connect that news with stories about everyday life, from parenting to relationships to living with and thriving with a serious mental health issue. So, take the Mindset Challenge, dare to see mental health differently, because understanding why we do what we do makes us all do better. On today's show, college students and mental health. Kathleen and Mark Walker are attorneys in El Paso, Texas, who got a law passed requiring universities in Texas to give thorough information about mental health resources to incoming students. Kathleen and Mark's motivation was born out of their personal tragedy. After their son, Lee, finished his freshman year at the University of Texas, El Paso, he died by suicide. Who their son was, and what the Walkers have to say to parents, how schools might do a better job alerting students and parents about mental health issues is today's show. But first, this news from the Mindset Report. The Mindset Report, available online at mindsetreport.com. The Mindset Report, your most comprehensive online source for mental health news. And if you like what we're doing here on Mindset, log on to our website. That's mindsetshow.com. Click on the Support Us tab right there near the top of the page and shop our affiliate vendors on that page. There you can find everything from electronics to vitamins. If you shop Amazon, shop to your heart's content through our website. From AFSP, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Dr. Doreen Marshall spoke with me about the dynamics of kids, school and social pressures, and mental health. My guest is Dr. Doreen Marshall, Senior Director of Education and Prevention for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. Marshall, thank you so much for joining me. I want to talk to you about a recent conversation that I had with a couple whose son died by suicide. What she said to me is, one of the things that you ask yourself is, what did I miss? And she talks about the idea of wishing that she had had more information. A bit about her son, Lee. He was a college freshman. He had finished his first year. They visited him regularly. He was a nice kid, an honorable kid. He succumbed to suicide. Is that something that parents often ask themselves when they find themselves in this situation?
Yeah, I think it's very common, not only for parents who lose a child to suicide, but for anyone who loses someone close to them to suicide, to look back and feel like hindsight is 20/20, meaning that they look back and they see things that at the time seemed isolated or didn't seem to really have a lot of meaning, but in the context of a death by suicide, have a great deal of meaning. So, we know that when people die by suicide, sometimes they do things.
This is Mindset, mental health news and information. Thanks for tuning in. I'm your host. With a couple whose most comprehensive online source for mental health news. Shop Amazon, shop to your heart's. Her son, Lee, he was a college freshman. He had finished his first year. They visited him regularly. He was a nice kid, an honorable kid. He succumbed to suicide. Is that something that parents often ask themselves when they find themselves in this situation?
Yeah, I think it's very common, not only for parents who lose a child to suicide, but for anyone who loses someone close to them to suicide, to look back and feel like hindsight is 20/20, meaning that they look back and they see things that at the time seemed isolated or didn't seem to really have a lot of meaning, but in the context of a death by suicide, have a great deal of meaning. So, we know that when people die by suicide, sometimes they do things leading up to their death, or we notice certain things that may be indicative of a mental health struggle. But at the time, it's hard to kind of connect those dots. And so I think what she said to you is actually very common when people lose a family member to suicide.
Does the research or your experience bear out that knowing where to turn for students, for parents, can be significant, can make a difference?
Well, certainly, when you think about how people get connected to help, there's kind of two components. One is recognizing that there's a need for help, and then the other is knowing where to go for help. I say that parents, or really any person that is concerned about another person, should educate themselves on both. This idea of how do I know when I need help or when someone I love needs help, and then also, and where do I go if I have that sense that someone is needing help? I don't know the situation, obviously, that you're talking about, but I would guess is that, both of those things needed to line up in a way. And that doesn't mean that the outcome would have been different. We certainly don't know that, but it's the idea of being able to recognize, kind of signs of a mental health struggle, for example, or signs that the person is maybe thinking about suicide, and then also knowing what to do once you have that information.
One of the things, again, going back to my conversation with Kathleen Walker, she said, I wish there was just a checklist, something that I could just know what some indicators were. Does anything like that exist? Are there certain indicators that are more significant than others?
Yeah, there's certainly lots of information in terms of kind of what we think of as warning signs or potential indicators. One of the things that we do know is that roughly 90% of people who die by suicide had a mental health concern, be it depression, anxiety, or something like that. It may not have been diagnosed, but we know that there's a connection there. The other, thing that people should pay attention to is kind of someone who their behavior is very different. They go from, it's a sudden change. Someone who's really angry or agitated in a way that seems uncommon for them. Someone who has talked about suicide or made reference to not wanting to live anymore, or wishing that they were dead. It's sometimes people who are thinking about suicide kind of put out clues. And so in the instance when that information is available, that's really our best opportunity to get them connected to help before they make an attempt. The other thing I would say is if somebody has made a suicide attempt previously in their history, that's important information. It doesn't mean that they will necessarily go on to die by suicide, but what it does mean is that at some point when stress got too big or they were feeling overwhelmed, that they turn to suicide as a potential way to cope with that pain. And so when we know someone has done that before, it's important for us to just be mindful that that could happen again for someone who has struggled in the past.
Mr. Walker said that he's convinced parents, we need to change the conversation that we have with our kids, just in general, even before we get to a point of we think there may be indicators of a situation that warrants intervention.
Absolutely. And I think the best way to have that conversation is to have a pretty direct conversation. And so how you might do that, and I don't think you need to wait till they go off to college, but I think that you can have this conversation, certainly when they're in high school. And the conversation might go something like this. Many people, when they feel overwhelmed or they feel like they can't cope, might have thoughts of wanting to end their life. I'm wondering if you've ever had those kinds of thoughts. Just to ask directly. If for the person that's on the receiving end of that, it's not going to put the idea in their head if they haven't already thought it. But if they have thought it, it does open up that communication so that they know that you're someone who's interested in asking, that you want to know that information. And if they say that they haven't had those thoughts, then I think the next step is to let them know that if they ever have those thoughts, that there is help and that you want to be a person that they talk to about that. I think when students are going off to college, sometimes they have a bit of a romanticized view about what that is like. And the reality is it can be an incredibly stressful time. For many of them, it's the first time they're having to manage their activities of daily living, like, cooking and doing laundry and all of that on their own. And they're also trying to cope with balancing lots of schoolwork, probably more than many of them are used to. So, I think also being realistic about the stressors that they may experience when they go to college is another way to help prepare them. Sometimes the stress of college can actually exacerbate a mental health concern or, can actually bring one on in somebody who has some vulnerabilities.
I noticed that AFSP, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, under your leadership, has partnered with a number of other organizations, one of which is Mental Health First Aid. Is that something that you would recommend for just folks in general as a good way to become better attuned to what indicators might be in loved ones, friends, coworkers, or just people in general that you might run across?
Absolutely. The Mental Health First Aid program was developed by the National Council for Behavioral Health in conjunction with some of their partners, and it's a program that educates any person. So you do not need to be, a clinician or a counselor. It really is a community training. Educates any person on kind of signs of mental health distress and signs of mental health concerns. So just like we might recognize somebody who is having a physical health issue, chest pains, and we all know that means potential heart attack. It helps people understand what some signs of mental health concerns might be and how to respond to those. So, from that perspective, I think it helps people to educate themselves about this so that they can respond, whether it's someone in their family or one of their kids' friends, for example, to be able to recognize it and then be able to help connect that person to help. So those kinds of programs, educational programs, I think really can help people become equipped with knowing, how to recognize it, but then also what to do once you have that information.
In the wake of what has to be the most devastating type of loss, the loss of a loved one to suicide, what's your advice to parents, loved ones, acquaintances, survivors of suicide loss, as what do you do next?
Well, certainly I agree with everything you said, that this loss, losing someone you love to suicide, has some really unique characteristics. And I think one of them is it makes it hard for people to reach out for help because there's this sense of stigma around it, and often feelings of shame. At AFSP and at our website, which is www.afsp.org, we have a national listing of survivor of suicide loss support groups that are around the country. And these are groups where people can kind of join with other families, other individuals that are experiencing a suicide loss and get support, get resources. Certainly, one of the things we know is it helps people to actually share what's happened, and these are safe rooms in which to do that. The other thing we do every year is we do a broadcast. It's the International Survivor of Suicide Loss Day broadcast. It's always the Saturday before Thanksgiving, and what happens is that there's a film that's available to be seen online or at an event near you. And what that film is the film where people are talking about coping with suicide loss. So there's this sense of, hearing how others are coping, but also joining with others that are watching the film. But it's a time where people can log on our website and get that, see the film on the website or join a community event. And we also have a listing of those as well through our website.
Dr. Doreen Marshall, she's the Senior Director of Education and Prevention at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. Marshall, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
For these and other details about mental health news, check out the Mindset Report online at mindsetreport.com. Today's topic, college students and mental health. We're back in just a moment.